Good evening, friends. My name is Pamela Mann, and I want to welcome everyone to tonight's session. We're so very fortunate to have Dr. Ted O'Connell, who is the Program Director at Kaiser Napa Solano Family Medicine Residency. He is here with us tonight to talk about the fundamentals of virtual interviewing. Tonight's session is fairly short, only about 30 minutes. So we've collected some questions ahead of time, which we're going to go through during tonight's session. But if you do have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat. And if we don't get to them, we'll certainly follow up with an FAQ or, if needed, another session like one of these. Just to let everyone know, your lines have been muted ahead of time, so we really encourage you to use that chat function. So Dr. O'Connell, welcome. Thanks so much for being here tonight. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great, thank you very much for that introduction, Pam, and I'd like to thank you and Shelley and Josh at the CAFP for inviting me to be part of this. When Pam reached out, and I would like to welcome all of the students who graciously took out some time from your evening to join the session and hopefully to learn a thing or two about interviewing, especially during this virtual interview season that's coming up. When Pam reached out to me and asked if I would do this session on virtual interviewing, I jumped at the opportunity because we've been talking to a lot of students over these last couple of months, and it's very clear that there's a lot of uncertainty and anxiety around what's going to happen this year and how to do virtual interviewing and how to get a sense of the people and the culture of residency programs and how to put your best foot forward and figure out which programs are most right for you. And at the same time, there's all the other background anxieties about having had rotations canceled and exams rescheduled and maybe not getting the letters of recommendation that you want. And I think it's important for me and the other program directors out there to tell you that we're also dealing with a lot of uncertainty about how to do virtual interviews well and how to tell you about the culture of our residency programs and how to get you to meet the great people that are part of our programs. And so we want to figure this out with you. And I'm hoping that just by talking through some of the things that you can do to prep for virtual interviews, we'll decrease some of the anxiety. And my program's been doing some Zoom sessions, and I'm sure others are as well, to try to talk through some of the things that you can do to really hopefully just decrease the anxieties and find the programs that are most right for you. We only have about 30 minutes this evening, and we did get some questions that have come in that Pam is going to toss my way. This will be all Q&A session. If we have time, once the initial questions have been answered, we'll certainly get to your questions, and you can send those in through the chat. And if we don't have enough time to get to those or get to all of them, I am very happy to do some future Zoom sessions and re-invite you back so that we can get to those, because I really do want to answer what's on your mind. At the end, I'm going to put in the email address of our residency coordinator. We've been nurturing an email distribution list for the Zoom sessions that we've been hosting. So if once I put that in, you can email Gilbert, one of our coordinators, and he'll put you on the list, and we'll get you invited to those future sessions. So with that, Pam, why don't you go ahead and kick us off?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. The first question is, what suggestions do you have for preparing for a virtual interview?
That's a great question. And there's actually a lot you can do to prepare. And actually just going online, you'll find lists of things and even advice that you can do, just generally speaking, for virtual interviews. So I'm going to use some of those lists as kind of a jumping off point and talk about it specifically around family medicine residency programs or residency programs in general. So one of the first is make sure that you're comfortable with the technology and have tested it. Different residency programs will be using different platforms. It may be Zoom, it may be Teams, it may be something else. And you're going to have to be a little bit nimble going across those different platforms. So just make sure that you're comfortable with that so that you're not having that cause you any anxiousness during your interview days. Preparing for your interviews is a good thing to do. So I've actually collected a list of almost any question that you can be asked during a residency interview and put those up on my website. I'll put a link there as well. And the goal there is really to have applicants be comfortable with questions they might be asked. And what I always recommend is that you go through those questions and have at least thought about the type of answers you'd provide to each of those questions, and also prepare some of those. Jot down some notes about your thoughts about what you might answer for each of those in a residency interview. This way, if you've thought about all of them, you're unlikely to really get blindsided by a tough question. And then I would say, I always suggest to applicants that they practice some of those. You don't want to do practice to the point where it sounds rehearsed, but just answering some of them so you really get comfortable with that process. And so find some family and friends that will give you honest feedback. And then I would say this year, do it through Zoom or do it through Teams or do it through FaceTime, some type of platform so that you're really practicing in this environment and can get feedback about that as well from friends and family, and find people who will give you some honest feedback. You want to set the scene and minimize distractions. What that means is, shut off your phones and pagers and whatever else might go off, pets that are in your office or your room, wherever you're going to be doing this. And also just consider what's in the background. I have records. This happens to be my office, but you want to consider what kind of image you're going to portray. And if you look at CNN or any other interviews that are being done, a lot of people have things staged behind them with bookshelves that have certain books on it, even down to that level of detail. I'm not sure you really need to do that, but do consider just what's in the background and try to keep the whole environment kind of quiet. You want to dress well. This is a professional interview, and I would suggest dressing just as you would for an in-person interview, so you are putting your best professional foot forward, both with the background and in the way that you look. Monitoring body language is important. These interviews are kind of a tough environment, and interviewers are going to be listening to you and watching you, perhaps even in a little bit more detail than they would in person, because we are social creatures and we look at social cues and deep in our brains look at body language. And so monitor your body language and your positioning. And when you do those practice sessions with friends and family, ask them to give you feedback about how you're appearing on the other side of that video. While you're doing all of this, be yourself. One of the things that I really talk with medical students and applicants about is you really want to assess a residency program and try to get a sense of the fit and how you will fit with that residency program and their culture, and how the fit is for you and what you think of the people. And I think you really do need to be as authentic as possible so that you can get a real assessment about how that fit and feel works for you. And that's a tough thing to sometimes decipher in a real environment, and now in a virtual environment just gets even a little bit tougher. Trying to make a connection is important. These interviews will be probably somewhere between 30 and 60 minutes a piece. Every program is going to be doing a little bit differently, but if you can try to make a human connection with the person that you're interviewing with, that just will help on multiple levels. And so that gets back to the preparation and trying to find out who you might be interviewing. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but who you might be interviewing with, so you know a little bit about their background and can utilize that to make that human connection. And then finally, following up after the interview. It's just always kind of social norms to make sure you follow up and drop a thank you note to the people that interview you. It makes a really good impression. It's a good way to further that human connection that you've made with them and help them remember you when it comes time to develop a match list.
That's great. Well, speaking of all of those things, what can students do to make sure that they stand out and get noticed by residency programs?
That's a great one, Pam. And I kind of view that in three different time periods. There's the things you can do before your interview to really set the stage for standing out, the things that you can do during an interview, and then the things you can do after an interview. And I touched on a few of them, but I'd like to take a deep dive into this. So the first one is to really know what's on your transcript in your dean's letter. I think most schools allow you to read your dean's letter and to see what's in your transcript. The bottom line is you don't want to be caught by surprise during your interview day. And if you had a difficult interaction with a resident and that showed up on an evaluation, or you had a grade that maybe wasn't as ideal as you would like, or whatever it is, you want to know that that's in your application to these residency programs, because you might get asked about it, and you want to not get blindsided by that. And you also want to take the opportunity, if there is something in there that's less than ideal, no matter what it is, to be able to own it. And that's one of the things that I really talk with students about, is if there's a board score or a rotation evaluation or some other difficulty that you had, residency programs want to know that you've owned it and have kind of grown from that, and have developed yourself professionally so that those types of things hopefully won't happen again. And so that's an opportunity, just by knowing that it's there, to prepare for how you're going to either answer questions about it or proactively address it. Looking at your CV, it's really important to go through your resume, your CV, and think about what kind of story that tells, and to remember the details. If you've done research, you may have done something that's interesting to an interviewer, and they may ask you about that research or that volunteer activity or that paper that you wrote or whatever it is, and you want to be ready to talk about it. And it just does. And so you want to really get into your CV and try to remember details of what you've done and who you worked with, because again, you may be making networking connections as you do this, or you really just don't want to have something that is in your resume that looks like you're proud of it, and then you don't really remember details, because then it looks like you kind of were not really that engaged. And so just looking at all those details, and then thinking about what kind of story it portrays. If you're applying to family medicine residencies and you did 2 years of surgical research because initially you thought you were going to be a surgeon and then changed your mind, you want to be ready to talk about that, and what it was about family medicine that attracted you, and then what you did to kind of redirect your experience in your resume. So just really considering what's in your CV. I mentioned earlier going through common interview questions and considering all of those. The more prep you do ahead of time so that you are comfortable answering those questions and don't get surprised, I think the better. One thing that I definitely recommend that you do is do some research about the residency program where you're going to be interviewing, and really have a good sense of what they're all about, and take notes about questions that you might want to ask during the interview process. This is all just part of the preparation. What you don't want to do is ask an interviewer a question about their program when the answer is on page 1 of their website, because then that just looks like you really haven't prepared. You may not be that invested or that interested in that program, and that could hurt you during the interview. So really doing some prep work. And then within that, once you're offered an interview for a residency program and it's scheduled, I recommend reaching out to the coordinator and ask if they might be able to tell you who's going to be interviewing you that day. And some programs may not be able to tell you, or don't necessarily have that level of organization to tell you in advance. But if they do, then you can go on to the website or even just do a Google search about those individuals and learn a little bit about them in terms of their professional backgrounds and their personal interests, their research, their community engagement, whatever it is, so that during that interview, you have that opportunity to tap into some of that to make a personal connection about those individuals. And then, as I said before, preparing some questions that you might want to ask. Anytime during an interview, if somebody says, "So do you have any questions?" you don't want to say no. You want to lead with, "Yes, I do have some questions." And the more specific they are about that individual or about the residency program, it will demonstrate that you have really done your research and have a true interest in that program. Then so that's all the pre-work. And then during the interview, there's a number of things that you can do. One is you should take some brief notes as you're having your interview. You don't want to be hunched over your desk furiously writing notes, but just some key words that will remind you about some of the topics that you covered with your interviewer. And you want to do that because it will help you when you go back to recollect and think about each residency program, but it will also help when it comes time to write some thank you notes or thank you emails, because then you'll be able to remember some of the topics that you discovered and really write a personalized thank you note. You want to take notes about the name of each person who interviewed you and their role in the residency program, again, for remembering purposes and also so that you can follow up. And then finally, after the interview process, it is important to write a thank you note of some kind. And there's a lot of debate online about whether it should be an email or a handwritten note. I don't really have a strong opinion. I tend to think that an email, it's 2020, and email is absolutely fine. We're all used to communicating electronically. A handwritten thank you note does have a little bit of a personal touch, but it also may limit the amount that you can actually write, just because it's a little bit more tedious to actually write things out, and you may have some space limitations. But an email is absolutely fine. A couple questions that always come up is who you should write a thank you email or note to. And the answer is really anyone who you've interviewed with that spent a significant amount of time with you. And then when should you send it out? Really, you should send it out pretty shortly after your interview for a couple of reasons. One is it makes it seem like you are very organized and on top of things. Two, your memory will be freshest about that interview and the topics that you covered and what you discussed, and you're likely to just write a better note. And then finally, the question becomes, like, what should you put in that note? And I always advise that this is the reason why you were taking notes about who you interviewed with and the topics you discussed, because you can really then write a personalized note, and you can say, I really enjoyed connecting with you about this, whatever it is that we have in common, or I enjoyed hearing about this particular part of the residency program, and this really resonates with me, or this is something that really attracts me to your program. But the more personal it is, the better. Do make sure that you don't send identical emails out to multiple people in the same program. You'd be surprised how often that actually happens. And it just shows, we often, program directors, faculty, residents often do share emails because we want each other to be aware that these are coming in. They often go into a common file. And when you see that they're identical, it just shows kind of potentially a lack of interest or a lack of effort around that. So if you're doing thank you emails, do them so that they're really quite unique and personalized. Then a couple of other things you can do after the fact. This is, again, a very unique year where programs likely won't be able to do open houses, second looks very likely won't happen. A lot of the on-site, even social events, very likely to not happen. And so it is important, though, for you to find ways to interact with the programs that you're particularly interested in. And so I would suggest following it up and asking if they're going to be doing any virtual happy hours or other type of social events, virtual second looks. You can just email to follow up and say you're really interested. If there are programs that you're very highly interested in, you may try to see if there are, and you happen to be in the area, maybe opportunities to get involved with some community service work or even research or things along those lines. If you would have to really want to be interested in a program to do that. But if there's one that is your dream program, I would say do as much as you possibly can. At least ask about the opportunity to do that. I would say ask the program coordinators or people that you interview with if there are residents that you can connect with so that you meet more people from that program. Just get creative, but you really do want to get a sense of of the people and the place and the culture, and demonstrate your interest to those that you're really, really interested in. And then the other question becomes a strategy of, if there's a program that's clearly your number one, should you tell a program that? I'm a pretty firm believer that you should, and that you really should only say that to one program, so that you're not, so that you're really being truthful. But that's probably a whole separate discussion.
Mhm.
So
Okay.
Pam, I know that was a mouthful, but
yeah, no, that was great, and I think you're knocking out some questions that are coming through, so that's great.
Oh, good. I'm not even looking at the chat, so good.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how residency programs will be conducting their virtual interviews in terms of length, format, and the number of interviews this season?
Yes. That's actually a really complex question. And I think programs are going to be all over the place, just like they are with regard to what type of platform they'll be using. In terms of length, they're probably going to be variable. 30 minutes is my guess, kind of at the minimum, and an hour probably at the maximum, and somewhere in the 30 to 45 minute range to be in the sweet spot. Format could be variable, that they may be one-on-one. You may have group interviews. I'll tell you, our initial plan is to do an interview with the program director, a faculty member, and a resident, each as individual interviews. That's what we do when we're on site. And so I think trying to stick with that. We've had a lot of discussion about other formats, but we also really are wanting to be cognizant of how fatiguing this is going to be for applicants. And so we want to keep the interviews not too long, and have them have a chance to meet, both faculty and residents. And then number of interviews, I think in a particular interview day, I think how many people will you interview with? Probably 2 to 4, maybe a little, somewhere in that range, maybe more if they're doing group interviews. There's a lot of discussion about doing some other kind of screening tools in advance, where you may ask some questions, kind of behaviorally based questions, so that programs can try to do some additional evaluation. We've looked at those and kind of realized that asking applicants to do that is just extra work and kind of an extra barrier, an extra hurdle. And this, as I said at the outset, already a challenging, stress-inducing year, and we don't want to add, any of that extra layers. That's our own personal decision, but there's a lot of programs in California, and certainly a lot nationwide. I think you're going to see a lot of variability in terms of how this is approached. And then in terms of number of interviews overall, that's different for each program, like how many people will each program interview. That's unique to each individual program, so I wouldn't really want to take a stab at that one. And that's, and ultimately it probably doesn't really matter. You really just want to put your best foot forward and be the best applicant that they see that day, that week, to really try to impress them, especially if it's a program you like.
Mm-hmm. Great. So you talked about this just a little bit, you touched on it, but now we're in a time where you can't meet people in person, you can't shake hands, you can't have dinner, you can't explore the places that you're interviewing at. So can you talk a little bit about how a candidate can evaluate the culture of a residency program while doing virtual interviews?
Absolutely, Pam. I'll try to answer that one. And I think that's going to be one of the most difficult things to evaluate in this virtual environment. Clearly, if a student has already rotated at a site, they may have some sense of the culture. But for most applicants at most programs, that won't be the case. And I'll tell you, that's one of the things that programs are really struggling with too, is how do we tell you about how do we show you what our culture is? How do we tell you what our culture is? And it's just going to be challenging in this virtual environment. One thing that you certainly can do is take a really good look at program websites and look at the wording they use about their people, about their curriculum, about the program, because words, do matter and can often give you at least a hint of the culture. I know that many programs are working very actively to try to put out some additional videos and additional pictures on their websites and even through social media and things like that to really try to portray who they are and what they're about, because this, like I said, virtual environment is really different. You can ask about the culture too. And I would suggest asking faculty and residents and see what they say, and kind of the responses you get and the words that are used in describing their culture, I think can be quite informative. I had mentioned earlier trying to find other ways to interact with faculty and residents, even if it's a virtual happy hour or virtual meet and greet, just to meet more of the people. I think that can give you a better sense of the culture. And then that's more people that you can also ask that same question. So, hey, tell me about the culture of your residency program, and see what type of answers that you get. And then if you have access to any of the graduates, I think that's a really great way to get some input about culture. And you can even reach out to, most likely, it's probably most beneficial after your interview day, but you can reach out to the coordinator, demonstrate your interest by reaching out, ask if there are any graduates that you might be able to speak with. Sometimes that's a little bit challenging because those graduates are now attending physicians or in fellowship and are likely to be really busy, but if they're able to put you in touch with some of their graduates, they can give you, an idea of culture with even some distance between themselves and their graduation date, and perhaps a little bit more perspective and maybe even a little bit more accurate or honest answer, because they're not necessarily part of the program any longer and don't really have any skin in the game. So, there are ways to assess it. It's not likely to be as perfect as it would be in person, but I think valuable nonetheless.
That's great. So we're about at time. This has been a very informative discussion. We have about 3 minutes. So I want to ask one more question and then leave about a minute for closing remarks. So, this is a virtual world. Do you have any advice about when there's some technical glitches, if the internet connection goes out, or, things that might come up just around virtual issues?
Yes, I do actually. A couple of years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, we actually piloted the idea of doing virtual interviews to try to reduce carbon footprint and, acknowledging the cost in terms of dollars and time for applicants to come and join us. And we were running into a lot of technical issues at that time. Zoom was not as ubiquitous as it is now, and we were using Skype, and our firewall was an issue. So, and I'm saying this to acknowledge technical issues happen, and I think my best advice is kind of roll with it, politely, if it's on the applicant side, politely, apologize for it. If it's on the program side and you're the applicant, roll with it, kind of laugh about it, do whatever you can to get that person on the other side is probably frustrated or embarrassed or some other emotion, and whatever you can do to kind of ease that tension is good. Remember that you're always being evaluated too. Whoever's on the interviewer maybe it's nobody's fault that there's a technical issue, but the same type of things happens in medicine. Patients run late, there are technical issues, things come out of left field that can be challenging, and they may take that opportunity, if this tech issue, to see how is this person going to react to a stressful situation, and do they keep their calm, do they remain professional? So just remember that the interview is still going even during that technical issue. And if it takes a long time, you may end up having to reschedule the day. If something goes down completely on the side of a program or for a prolonged period of time. And I think just keeping in mind the more flexible you possibly can be, the more polite, the more professional. I think that's a good idea. And evaluate how the program, that gets back to this culture idea. Evaluate how the program handles a tough situation as well, because that may tell you a little bit about the kind of the overall vibe there. Great.
Well, we've reached time. Dr. O'Connell, thank you so much for spending your time with us this evening. A lot of questions have come in. I think you answered most of them, but we'll certainly gather them and either put an FAQ together or do another one of these sessions. It's such a rich discussion. So I just wanted to thank you for your time. And for those on the line, thank you for joining this webinar. We'll be sure to follow up and provide more information that we hope is helpful as you embark on the interview season. So with that.
Yes, thanks Pam for having me. I put one of our residency coordinators' email in the chat as in case you want to put your name on a list. I will set up another Zoom to answer some of these questions that came in through the chat. I put my website address there as well because that's where that list of common interview questions are, as well as a number of other blogs about interviewing tips and skills. So hopefully that's helpful to all of the students who are joining us as well.
Great. Thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.